The thing about a quiet neighborhood pool at night is that you can hear everything: the ripple of water, the squeak of a gate hinge, even the way someone's voice tightens when they think they're in charge. I didn't know that on this particular evening, the usual calm was about to turn into a full-blown showdown, set off by something so petty it almost felt like a prank. Almost. What happens when my band guests become the lifeguards' only witnesses? I kept asking myself that later, because at the time, I was too stunned to even form the question. 1 second, I'm walking up with a small group of friends, people I've invited a dozen times before, and the next, I'm watching them get stopped like we'd crossed into some private kingdom. The guard's stance was stiff, like he'd rehearsed it, and the gate light hummed overhead, bright and a little harsh. I didn't argue. Not yet. I just felt that hot, slow bloom of embarrassment that turns into anger when you realize you're being put on display. The pool deck was half empty. The chairs were scattered like abandoned props. The lake air smelled like warm algae and sunscreen, and everything about the scene screamed normal summer night, except the part where my guests were being turned away. At first, I genuinely thought it was a misunderstanding. I'd scanned everyone in, same as always. Our association uses resident badges, little plastic cards that open the pool gate and log entries. Friends don't have badges, obviously, so the rule has always been simple: residents can bring guests, keep them close, clean up after them, and don't exceed the posted daytime limit. I'd followed that for years. But the guard blocked the path with this calm, overfed authority, the kind that doesn't come from confidence but from knowing he's backed by the board. He waved at a laminated sheet clipped to his clipboard. I could tell from his face that he was enjoying the moment. A couple nearby residents looked over. Not because I was loud, I wasn't, but because something about being stopped at your own pool draws attention like a flare. I felt my jaw tighten. And that's when I noticed the new sign taped to the gate rail. Fresh paper, clean black letters, dated that week. It said there was now a nightly visitor cap. Not per household. Not per group. A cap for the whole pool, after 7 p.m. It hadn't been there yesterday. I stared at it, then at the guard. I could feel the night breeze on my shoulders, cool and a little damp, and I had this weird moment where I saw how ridiculous it was, grown adults being rationed like movie tickets by a guy in a neon shirt. Still, I kept my voice even. I asked for the policy number. He pointed to a line on the sheet, Policy 4.2, Evening Attendance Safety Adjustment. Under it, a warning note already had my unit number handwritten in. That part was the first jab. An official-looking warning, prepared ahead of time, like they'd been waiting for me. I didn't say much. I told my friends I'd go in alone, that we'd figure something out later. They tried to shrug it off, but their faces said what mine couldn't. This felt personal. I went through the gate, walked past the lifeguard stand, and sat on the edge of the pool with my feet in the water. The surface was glassy, lit turquoise from below, while the lake beyond was pitch dark. I tried to breathe. Because I knew who was behind this. Let me back up a second, because our neighborhood isn't the kind of place people imagine when they hear association drama. It's lakefront, landscaped, and honestly pretty gorgeous. The pool sits on the edge of the water with a view that makes sunsets feel cinematic. Families barbecue there on weekends. Teens do their awkward summer flirting by the shallow end. Retirees float around like sleepy seals in the mornings. Most of us just want that. Simple, easy, no nonsense. But every community has a pressure point. Ours is the board. The association committee here is small but loud, and for the last 2 years, the loudest voice belonged to a woman I'll call Ms. R. She isn't technically the president anymore, she stepped down after a messy vote, but she runs the place emotionally. You know the type: perfectly pressed golf shirts, a smile that never touches her eyes, and an obsession with rules that feels less about safety and more about control. She also has a tight friendship with our security contractor's supervisor. Not even subtle. They talk at community events like it's a duet, and the guards treat her like she's the mayor. If she wants something enforced, especially against someone she doesn't like, it happens fast. And me? I've been quietly on her list since last summer. It started small. I hosted a birthday hangout for my cousins visiting friends, all adults, all respectful. We used the pool for 2 hours on a weekday. We cleaned everything. We left no trace except some wet footprints on the deck. The next day I got a final notice dated May 12th slipped under my door. That's evidence prop number 1, and I still remember the date because of how out of nowhere it was. The notice claimed I'd brought excessive unregistered visitors and violated the daytime guest limit. It threatened a fine if it happened again. No photos. No names. No real proof. Just that crisp board letterhead, a signature block, and a dramatic tone that was way too eager for conflict. I emailed back politely, asking for clarification and the attendance record they were citing. I referenced the posted rule. I offered to meet. The response was icy, vague, and basically said, "We know what we saw." That was when I realized the rules weren't the point. The feeling of being watched was the point. After that, whenever I came to the pool with any guest at all, I'd feel eyes on me. If Ms. R was there, she'd do this thing where she'd sit upright, scan the deck, and then text someone. It wasn't paranoia. I'd watch a guard stroll over a few minutes later, just checking badges, always hovering by my group longer than anyone else's. I wasn't trying to start a war. I'm not even a confrontation person. I just don't like being bullied in my own neighborhood. So I started doing what I always do when someone tries to twist a story about me. I started paying attention. Not in a dramatic spy way. More like quiet receipts. I took photos of posted signs when they changed. I kept emails. I noted dates in my phone when random warnings appeared. The pool is a shared space, so the rules should be clear and consistent. If they weren't going to play fair, I needed facts. That summer calmed down eventually. Ms. R got distracted by some ongoing feud about landscaping, and I started to hope we'd moved on. Then fall came, and so did new bylaws. In October, the committee released a slim, community safety refresh. It was basically a pamphlet of reminders nobody asked for: no glass near water, music at a respectful volume, kids must be supervised. Normal stuff. But buried in the middle was a new line about nighttime capacity limits subject to security discretion. Security discretion. That phrase should come with warning lights. It's vague enough to be anything, and that means it can be used against anyone. I remember reading it twice in my kitchen while the rain tapped the window, feeling the first little tug of dread. I'd seen this move before. A rule that sounded neutral but was shaped like a weapon. I didn't know it yet, but the board had just set a deadline for themselves, because once I started collecting real evidence, their little cap game was going to backfire fast. The next morning, I woke up mad in that quiet, focused way that doesn't fade with coffee. Sunlight was pouring through my blinds, and I could hear a lawn crew buzzing outside. Normal neighborhood sounds, but my mind was stuck on last night's scene like a song loop you can't turn off. I opened my phone, pulled up our association portal, and checked for any official notice about the new nightly cap. Nothing. No email blast. No community post. Not even a dated update. Just that new paper sign taped to the gate, something anyone could have thrown up overnight. Okay, cool. If they wanted to play messy, I'd document messy. I grabbed a notebook from my kitchen drawer. The one I use for practical stuff like expenses and house notes. I wrote the date at the top and started a simple log: evening, time, number of people inside when I arrived, number of people leaving, number of chairs open, anything unusual. Not because I love drama. Because I don't trust vague power. That night, I went back to the pool solo around 8 p.m. The sky had that purple summer fade, and the water lights made the surface glow. I counted 14 people inside. 14. The cap supposedly had been hit the night before at 9. I sat on a lounger and watched. People came and went. A family left with 2 kids and a big float. 2 teenagers wandered out dripping and laughing. The number inside never climbed above maybe 18. At 8:30, another resident walked in with 2 friends. The guard didn't stop them. Didn't look at their wristbands twice. Just waved them in. I wrote it down. Over the next few nights I repeated the same quiet routine. Different times, different evenings. I didn't want a one-night snapshot. I wanted a pattern. Monday, 7:45 p.m., 12 people total. Guards still posted at the gate like a bouncer at a club nobody asked for. Tuesday, 9:10 p.m., 8 people. 8. The pool could have hosted a yoga class and still had room. Wednesday, 8:20 p.m., 15 people. A couple with guests entered freely. Every night, the cap was a ghost. It appeared only when I tried to bring people. At this point, I was living inside what I can only describe as a homeowners association drama vortex. Like a slow-motion Karen neighbor drama where the antagonist doesn't need to shout because the system shouts for her. But I stayed steady. No confrontations. No big emails. I let them think the warning scared me off. Meanwhile, I was building a clean, boring stack of facts. Then I did the simplest cross-check of all. I requested the badge entry log. Our portal has a feature where residents can ask for records tied to shared facilities. It's supposed to keep things transparent. I filled out the request with a neutral tone. I'd like the pool attendance logs for evenings between June 1st and June 10th, especially after 7 p.m., in relation to the newly implemented guest cap. 2 days later I got a reply from the property manager. Not the board, not Ms. R. The manager. And the email was weirdly careful. It included a spreadsheet showing nightly badge entries. But something jumped out right away. Most nights had fewer than 20 unique resident scans after 7 p.m. There was no way a pool-wide guest cap was being reached unless the cap was something absurd like 5 people total. And if that were true, it needed to be posted clearly for everyone. I highlighted the numbers. I matched them to my notes. They lined up almost perfectly. So now I had something real. Quiet, numeric, undeniable. I drafted a polite email to the board. I referenced Policy 4.2. I attached my log and the badge spreadsheet. I asked for a clear nightly limit number, a posted notice date, and an explanation for why some guests were allowed while mine weren't on the same evenings. I didn't accuse. I didn't get emotional. I wrote it like I was talking to actual adults who cared about fairness. I even ended with a line about wanting to avoid confusion and keep the pool a welcoming space. Then I hit send. And I waited. Not hopefully. More like, with the calm you get right before a storm you're pretty sure is coming. Their response didn't come for 5 days. When it finally did, it was a single paragraph from the secretary. No greeting, no thanks for bringing data. Just a blunt statement that security had full authority to enforce nighttime limits as deemed necessary, and that my previous warning under Policy 4.2 still stood. That was it. No mention of the logs. No answers. No posted number. They were banking on me backing down. On me feeling too embarrassed to push. And honestly, a year ago, maybe I would've. But something about seeing my friends turned away while others strolled in freely had flipped a switch. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what happens when a committee decides rules are for targeting, not for protecting. So I did something I hadn't planned on doing yet. I checked the bulletin board outside the clubhouse, where they pin meeting minutes. I read the last 2 months of notes line by line in the afternoon heat, the paper edges curling slightly in the sun. There it was. A tiny line in the June minutes, guest cap trial to address specific repeat issues. Specific repeat issues. No names, but it felt like a thumbprint. And worse, it confirmed the cap was being used as a trial, meaning it wasn't even a finalized rule. They were experimenting with residents' rights like it was a hobby. I took a photo of the minutes. Evidence prop number 3. Then I went home and opened a fresh page in my notebook. At the top, I wrote, plan. Because if the board wanted to pretend their cap was neutral while using it like a leash, I was done asking nicely. I wasn't going to break rules. I wasn't going to do anything reckless. But I was going to make sure the next time they tried to embarrass me at that gate, the only thing that got turned away was their credibility. And the funniest part? They still had no idea what I'd already gathered, or what I was about to do with it. I spent the rest of that week moving like I was completely normal, even though my head was basically a full-time investigation board. Work, errands, a quick wave at neighbors, the usual. But every time I passed the lake path and saw the pool fence glittering in the sun, I felt that same pulse of irritation. What I'd written on that notebook page, plan, wasn't about some dramatic stunt. It was about building a trap the board couldn't wriggle out of, using their own rules and their own paper trail. If they wanted to act like the cap was a trial for specific repeat issues, then I was going to make sure the whole neighborhood could see exactly how specific this enforcement was. Step 1 was getting the rule in writing. Not a taped sign. Not a vague line buried in minutes. Something official. Our association has to post policy changes to the resident portal within 72 hours, and they have to include the numerical limit. It's right there in the governance handbook, an unglamorous line almost nobody reads, which is exactly why people like Ms. are count on you not noticing. So I checked the portal every day. Nothing. I emailed the property manager again, politely asking when Policy 4.2's evening safety adjustment had been formally voted on and what the exact cap number was. I attached the June minutes photo and asked if it was still considered a trial. The manager replied within a few hours. Her tone was neutral but tight. She said the board had not yet posted a fixed number because they were monitoring conditions, but she confirmed that any trial rules still needed a formal notice if they affected access. In other words, even she knew the board was skating on thin ice. That was building pressure in the background. But I also needed a clean, public moment where their bias would show without me looking like I was hunting for a fight. At first I thought about bringing guests again right away, maybe on a busy Saturday, but that felt too predictable. Too easy for them to spin as me testing them. Instead, I waited for a night that would naturally draw more residents, something they couldn't claim was staged. And the chance landed in my lap on a Thursday. That afternoon, the neighborhood email chain was buzzing about a last-minute moonlight swim the committee was promoting. Basically a casual evening pool hang, no RSVP needed. It was supposed to be this feel-good community moment. I was almost impressed by the timing. Almost. Because a community night meant more witnesses. More badge scans. More eyes to compare their enforcement in real time. And most importantly, it meant I wouldn't be the only one noticing the cap gymnastics. I texted 3 friends again, the same ones who'd been turned away. They were hesitant, which honestly stung more than I expected. When your people start bracing before entering a shared space, you know something's off. I told them I'd handle everything and that if security pulled anything weird, we'd just leave quietly. No arguing. No scene. I promised I wasn't dragging them into drama. The truth was, I was dragging the drama into the light. We met near the lake path around 7:30. The air was warmer than it should have been for evening, with that sticky glow that makes the deck lights look hazy. We walked up smiling like a normal group of adults. The gate sign was still there. So was the guard. He straightened when he saw me, like he'd been waiting all day. His clipboard was tucked tight under his arm. I felt my friends shift behind me. I looked past him at the pool. It was busier than usual, sure, but not packed. Maybe 25 people. Plenty of chairs still open. The water was a soft blur of moving silhouettes and reflected light. I scanned my badge. The gate clicked open for me, then stopped short for my friends. The guard lifted his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just said the cap was reached and no guests were allowed. Calm. Confident. Like this was the most natural thing in the world. Except right behind him, another resident arrived with 2 guests and walked through without being stopped. Same minute. Same gate. Same cap. I felt my chest go cold. Not in shock this time. In clarity. This wasn't sloppy enforcement. It was selective enforcement, in front of a crowd. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I stepped aside and let that other group pass so the moment stayed visible. Then I said to my friends, quietly, that we'd head out. They nodded, embarrassed again. They started turning back. That's when someone behind us, one of the older neighbors who's at the pool nearly every night, called out to the guard and asked what the cap number even was. No quotes here, but you get the vibe. His tone was more confused than angry, like he genuinely couldn't reconcile what he was watching. The guard got flustered. He muttered something about security discretion. Another person chimed in, asking why the other group had been allowed moments earlier. Now there were eyes everywhere. People lifting their heads from towels. The lifeguard looking up from his stand. The flat splash of someone doing laps pausing mid-stroke. I kept my expression neutral and let the questions hang there. I didn't need to add anything. The contradiction was doing all the work for me. The guard finally said the cap was for guests and that residents could still enter freely. Which was not what the sign said. The sign clearly made it a pool-wide visitor cap including residents and guests. It was also not what he'd claimed earlier in the week when he said the cap itself was reached, full stop. He was improvising. Publicly. The neighbor asked if that new guest-only cap had been posted anywhere. The guard said no, but that it was standard. Someone laughed, not cruelly, just in disbelief. The guard's face tightened. He waved my friends again to leave. My friends looked to me, waiting. I just shrugged like, hey, not worth it. We walked away, but this time, the embarrassment wasn't ours. It was his. We sat by the lake instead, feet dangling off the dock. The water slapped quietly against the pilings, and a boat engine hummed far out in the dark. My friends were salty but supportive. They kept saying it was ridiculous, that the board must have it out for me. I didn't say much. I was too busy replaying the moment. Witnesses. Questions. Contradictions. No yelling. No drama from me. That night was a gift. Hook. And here's the part that mattered, every time they pulled the stunt, they racked up financial risk for themselves, because selective enforcement isn't just petty, it's expensive when residents start filing formal complaints. The next morning, I wrote everything down while it was still crisp in my head. Time, crowd estimate, who entered, who got stopped, what the guard claimed. I added a new column to my log labeled Witnesses, even though I wasn't naming anyone. I just marked how many residents were present and visibly reacting. Then I filed an official incident report through the portal. The portal has a rule dispute form that most people use for things like parking stickers or landscaping fines. I'd never touched it before. But the system exists for a reason, and I was done pretending I couldn't use it. I kept the report simple. I stated that on the date of the community swim, security denied my guests due to a cap supposedly being reached, while allowing another resident's guest's entry moments later. I asked for the written cap number and the formal notice date. I referenced my earlier email and the fact that trial policies still require posting. I attached my attendance log, the badge spreadsheet, and the photo of the June minutes line about specific repeat issues. No emotions. No accusations about Ms. R. Just facts stacked like bricks. An hour later I got a confirmation number back. Then, nothing. 2 days passed. 3. By Monday, I'd heard through neighborhood chatter that the board was reviewing procedures. People were talking about the gate confusion now, not just my situation. I'd see neighbors on the walking trail shrugging and asking each other what the actual nighttime rule even was. A couple mentioned they'd been told different things on different nights, even without trying to bring guests. That was the shift I needed. The story was no longer me versus security. It was, nobody knows what's real anymore. And a board that thrives on control hates confusion they didn't script. On Tuesday, I got summoned to a compliance meeting. Not in those words, but that's what it was. The email was short and formal, asking me to attend a closed session with 2 board members and a security supervisor. Closed session. Not open to residents. Not recorded in minutes. My first instinct was to decline. That kind of off-the-books meeting is where they try to intimidate you without witnesses. But then I realized declining would let them paint me as non-cooperative. So I agreed, with one condition: I'd like the property manager present as a neutral observer, and I'd like a written summary afterward. They didn't respond to my condition. They just sent a time and location: the clubhouse office, Thursday at 6 p.m. I showed up early, clipboard in hand, mine, not theirs. The office smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and old carpet. The fluorescent lights made everything look a little too sharp. I sat across from the treasurer and the secretary. Ms. R wasn't officially there, but that didn't mean she wasn't involved. I could feel her influence in the room like perfume. The security supervisor stood by the door, arms crossed. The property manager was there too, thank God, sitting quietly with a laptop. They started by restating my May 12th final notice, as if it was proof I was a repeat problem. They brought up policy 4.2 again, saying the warning was still active. I listened. I kept my face calm. Then I pulled out my log. I slid forward the badge spreadsheet. I pointed to the nights with fewer than 20 people. I described the Thursday swim incident without adding any flair. I asked, again, for the numeric cap and posting date. The treasurer kept saying the cap was flexible for safety. The secretary said security had discretion to maintain order. They repeated those words like a chant. I asked a really basic question: if it's flexible, why was it enforced only against my guests when the pool was under capacity? They didn't answer directly. They pivoted to talk about resident complaints. Apparently, multiple residents had complained about large groups at night and noise. I asked for those complaint records, because that's also required under our governance handbook. If complaints are used to justify rule enforcement, residents can request a summary of them. The treasurer said they weren't obligated to share details. The property manager cleared her throat, just a small sound, but it cut through the air. She reminded them that complaint summaries, not names, are shareable when they're used to enforce access rules. Nice and professional. But it landed. For the first time, the treasurer looked unsure. The secretary tapped her pen faster. The supervisor shifted his weight. They tried another angle. They claimed I was bringing more guests than permitted. I asked them to show me the evening guest limit rule in writing. They said the daytime limit applied. I pointed out that the daytime limit is posted as 2 guests per resident before 7 p.m., and that no evening guest per resident limit had ever been posted. Their own new line in the October refresh called evening limits subject to discretion, which is not the same thing as a daytime numeric rule. Silence. In that silence, I felt the weirdest mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because my receipts were working. Sadness because I shouldn't have to litigate basic fairness to use a pool. The meeting ended with them saying they'd review the situation. They offered no apologies. No concrete numbers. But their posture had shifted. They weren't scolding me anymore. They were stalling. As I walked out, the sun had just dipped low, and the lake horizon was orange. I paused on the path, breathing in the faint chlorine smell drifting from the fence. For the first time since this started, I felt like I was steering. But boards don't like losing control gracefully. And I knew escalation was coming. Sure enough, Friday brought the next swing. Around lunchtime I got a fresh email blast from the board. It was sent to the whole community, not just me. The subject line was something like, clarification, night pool guest protocol. It was written in that fake-friendly tone committees use when they want to sound helpful while tightening the leash. The message announced an official nightly guest cap of 6 total guests in the pool after 7 p.m., regardless of how many residents were present. It said the change was effective immediately due to safety concerns, and that any resident exceeding the cap would receive fines. 6. For the whole pool. Even with a generous interpretation, that rule was ridiculous for a 50-person facility. It also contradicted their earlier meeting claim that the cap was flexible and undefined. But it did one thing I needed: it forced them to commit to a number in writing. And because it was an immediate change, it also had to be backed by a formal vote. That meant it would appear in the next public minutes. That meant I could track who pushed it through. Neighbors started reacting fast. My phone lit up with casual messages from people I didn't even know well. The vibe was the same. Wait, what? 6 guests total. So if I bring my sister and her husband, nobody else can have a guest. People were annoyed, but also confused in the way that makes annoyance spread. That night, the pool was busy. A warm breeze kept the bugs low, and you could hear softball game cheers faintly from across the lake. I went down around 7:15, not with guests, just to observe. There were already 4 guests inside with a family near the grills. 2 more were arriving behind me with another resident. The guard stopped them. He said the cap was now full. They argued a little, then left. The family with 4 guests looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd unintentionally locked the pool down for everyone else. You could feel social tension building, like static. It wasn't aimed at me this time. It was aimed at the cap. People were starting to see how unfairly it hit everyone. Still, I knew Ms. R and the board weren't done targeting. So I kept logging. I kept noting who got stopped and who didn't. Then Sunday morning, another email came. This one was just to me. It said I was being fined for attempted violation of the guest cap on the Thursday swim night. Not for having guests inside. For attempting. The fine amount was small but symbolic. It was their way of reasserting dominance, like a dog marking territory after you moved its bowl. I stared at my phone in this bright, quiet kitchen, feeling my hands go a little numb. Attempted violation. That phrase wasn't even in the handbook. It was made up. And the timing made it obvious they were retaliating for my report and meeting. This wasn't safety anymore. This was punishment. I walked to my desk, pulled out the governance handbook, and flipped to the enforcement section. There it was: fines require a documented violation, notice of evidence, and an appeal window. No attempted fines. No retroactive penalties for rules not formally posted at the time. I drafted another appeal. I cited their own timeline. I attached the email blast date showing the 6-guest cap wasn't announced until after that incident. I referenced the enforcement clause and asked for the fine to be voided. Then I did one more thing. I requested the audio recording of the closed compliance meeting. Our state laws don't require that kind of recording for closed sessions, but our association's bylaws do if enforcement decisions are discussed. It's a transparency clause tucked into the CCRs. Most boards ignore it until someone makes them look at it. If they'd recorded it, they had to provide it. If they hadn't, that was another compliance failure. Either way, I was widening the net. By this point, the board was risking something worse than a complaint: social shame. Because once the neighborhood realized this cap was born from a grudge, their reputations were going to sink faster than a pool toy with a hole in it. I'd been quietly logging half-empty pool nights, pulled badge records, and proved the cap was enforced only against my guests. After my formal report and a tense board meeting, they rushed out a tiny 6-guest nightly cap, then hit me with a made-up attempted violation fine. The escalation didn't stop there. It got weirder. Midweek, I saw a new laminated placard on the gate. Not just the guest cap, but a watch list-style reminder that certain residents were under enhanced monitoring for repeated violations. No names, no unit numbers. Just a statement bold enough to make people look around suspiciously, like anyone could be the target. It was a psychological tactic. Put the fear in everyone so nobody asks questions. But to me, it read like desperation. Because you don't deploy intimidation when you're confident. You deploy it when you're scrambling. Neighbors started whispering more openly now. I'd hear it in the parking lot. I'd catch it on the trail. People weren't just annoyed about guests anymore. They were annoyed about the way the cap had been thrown down without clarity, and the way security was acting like a roaming judge. A couple of residents told me they'd already emailed the board asking for a reconsideration. One even said she'd never seen the pools so tense at night. That tension was doing something I couldn't have engineered better if I tried. It was turning the spotlight toward the committee's motives. And that's when the property manager emailed me privately. She said the board had declined my request for the compliance meeting audio because they did not record it. She also said, carefully, that she'd advised them to follow standard posting procedures going forward. Translated, they'd broken their own transparency clause, and she knew it. I replied thanking her for confirming. Then I forwarded her email to my personal folder and added it to my evidence stack. By now, I had enough to push this into a formal hearing. Not a closed session. A real one. Public, on the record, with minutes posted. But I also knew something important about power-hungry boards: they overextend right before they fall. If I rushed the hearing now, they'd play victim, claim the community was in uproar because of problem residents, and try to drown my facts in noise. So I decided to wait a little longer. And during that waiting window, I started thinking about retaliation, not the reckless kind, but the lawful kind that makes bullies trip over their own paperwork. I had a few ideas already. But one in particular kept sharpening in my mind every time I walked past that gate and saw security pretending to be a king. It involved their own cap, their own logs, and a public board meeting they couldn't hide from. And if they kept pushing this, the next consequence wouldn't just be embarrassment, it could turn into a real legal-level headache for them, and I was about to set the stage for that. That idea I'd been turning over in my head wasn't complicated. It was the kind of move that looks obvious only after someone does it. The board had created a rule that harmed everyone, then tried to punish me for pointing it out. So the cleanest retaliation was to let the rule collide with reality in a way they couldn't edit. Our bylaws allow residents to submit an item for the next open meeting if 5 households sign on. It's meant for things like budget questions or maintenance concerns. But night pool guest cap qualified, especially because it affected access to shared property. I started quietly. I didn't blast a group chat. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just talked to people I already knew would care: the morning swimmers, the parents who used the pool to keep their kids sane in summer, the lakefront retirees who lived for sunset floats. I told them I was submitting a request to put the cap on the agenda and asked if they'd co-sign. I didn't mention Ms. R. I didn't make it personal. I just said the rule was inconsistent, not properly posted at first, and now unbelievably strict. People didn't hesitate. Some looked relieved someone was doing something. A few said they'd already wanted to complain but didn't know how. One neighbor even pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot of a guard telling her a completely different cap number the previous week. By the end of the day I had 9 signatures. I submitted the agenda item with a 1-page summary, timeline, official notices, the badge record showing low attendance on most evenings, and the enforcement discrepancies witnessed on the moonlight swim night. I also included my fine appeal as a separate attachment, because it was tied to the cap's rollout. The property manager confirmed receipt and said it would be listed for the next Wednesday meeting. That was the deadline I'd been waiting for. Once the cap hit a public agenda, the board couldn't dodge it anymore, and if they tried to rush a decision before then, they'd hand me an even bigger opening. The week before the meeting, something small but telling happened. On Monday night, I walked down to the pool at 8 p.m. Not to swim, just to check the vibe. The air was cooler now, carrying that faint metallic lake smell. There were maybe 16 people inside. A resident couple entered with 2 adult guests. The guard stopped them, counted, frowned, and then waved them in anyway. That was new. He'd never looked uncertain before. 2 nights later, the same couple came again. This time the guard told them the cap was full. They turned around, annoyed. 5 minutes later another group entered without being stopped at all. People noticed. You could hear it in the low, irritated conversations along the deck. The cap had turned the pool into a lottery, and security was drawing numbers without showing the jar. Meanwhile my fine appeal sat unanswered. The manager later told me the board planned to address it at the meeting. Sure. On the record. Where they couldn't twist it privately. By Tuesday I sensed the board's nerves spreading. The newsletter board by the clubhouse suddenly had more pinned notices than I'd ever seen. Reminders about civility, about respectful discourse at meetings, about not harassing staff. That last one was the giveaway. They knew this agenda item was about to get uncomfortable, and they were trying to pre-frame anyone who questioned them as a bully. I kept my head down and let them over-prepare. That was fine. The tighter they squeezed, the more obvious the power play looked. Wednesday arrived hot and bright, the kind of day where the lake sparkles like a mirror and everything feels a little too exposed. The meeting was at 6:30 p.m. in the clubhouse hall. I got there early with my notebook, my printed attachments, and a calm I'd practically rehearsed. The room filled fast. Way more people than usual. Folding chairs scraped across the tile. The air conditioner rattled and struggled. You could smell sunscreen and fresh-cut grass on everyone's clothes, like we'd all come straight from summer life into administrative battle. The board sat at their long table up front. Treasurer, secretary, president, and 2 at-large members. Ms. R wasn't seated there, but she was in the second row, legs crossed, posture perfect, like she was a guest star waiting for her cue. I summarized the timeline. I reminded them that the cap had appeared without formal notice, that on the Thursday moonlight swim my guests were denied while other guests were admitted moments later, and that badge records showed the pool never approached capacity on most nights. I referenced Policy 4.2, the October security discretion line, and the enforcement clause that fines require documented violations. I didn't talk fast. I didn't raise my voice. I treated it like a simple problem with simple facts. Then I showed the printed badge log, evening entries after 7 p.m. rarely above 20 residents. I held it up so people could see the numbers, not just hear them. A low murmur rolled through the room. I pointed out the 6-guest pool-wide cap made it impossible for multiple households to host even one friend each. It had turned the pool into a place where neighbors competed instead of relaxed. I also said, plainly, that selective enforcement had been witnessed by multiple residents on multiple nights. Then I asked 2 clear things. Rescind the 6-guest pool-wide cap and replace it with a posted, reasonable per household limit if needed, voted on properly. Void the attempted violation fine since the rule wasn't formally announced at the time and the handbook doesn't allow that category. I sat down. For a second, there was a kind of stunned quiet. The AC rattled. Someone shifted in their chair. The pool lights outside flickered on, a faint blue glow through the window slats. Then residents started speaking. Not in a chaotic way. One by one. A dad explained how he'd had to turn away his sister visiting from out of town because the cap was full even when the pool was empty. A retired couple said they'd been told 3 different cap numbers by security over 2 weeks. A teen's mom said her kid got scolded for bringing one friend after dark when another family had 5 guests right there. The room was landing exactly where I'd hoped, not on me, but on the pattern. Finally, the treasurer cleared his throat and tried to defend the cap as a safety measure. He said the community had complained about crowding. He said security needed freedom to respond. The president nodded along, careful, but you could tell they weren't all aligned. The more residents talked, the harder it got for them to pretend this was about safety. I raised my hand again, got recognized, and asked, still calm, if they could provide the complaint summaries they'd cited for justifying the cap. The secretary hesitated. She said complaints were private. The property manager, sitting off to the side, spoke up politely, reminding them that summaries without names are shareable when they form the basis of enforcement. That was the second time she'd had to say it. And this time, the room heard. People murmured louder. The treasurer said they'd consider providing a summary later. That's when something happened that I didn't plan but couldn't have written better. A resident in the back, one of those low-key people who rarely speaks, stood up and said he'd filed a complaint weeks earlier about a completely different issue, and he'd never gotten a confirmation. He asked how many complaints about pool crowding actually existed. He wasn't accusing anyone by name. Just asking a reasonable question. The treasurer looked straight at the property manager with this quick, tense glance. The kind that says, "Help me." She stayed quiet. She didn't rescue them. And in that silence, the truth got loud without anyone needing to shout. The president called for a short recess to review materials. People stood, stretched, whispered. The air felt electric. Through the windows, the lake was turning dark, and the clubhouse lights made the glass reflect our own faces back at us. When the board returned 5 minutes later, their vibe was different. Less scripted. More defensive-free. The president announced they were suspending the 6-guest pool-wide cap effective immediately and returning to the posted daytime guest rule for evenings until a properly voted replacement could be drafted. She said they'd send a community survey to determine a fair nighttime policy and would present a new proposal next month. A couple people clapped. Not in celebration, more in relief. Then she addressed my fine. She said the board was voiding it. She didn't say sorry. But she said the category attempted violation had been misapplied. Misapplied. Sure. But it was public now, and it was reversed. That mattered. I felt this clean flood of vindication move through me, quiet, not gloating. Like finally unclenching a jaw you didn't realize was tight. But the story didn't end right there. Because Ms. still hadn't been accounted for, and everyone could feel it. As the meeting moved on, a resident asked who had proposed the original pool-wide cap trial. Another asked why the cap had been enforced unevenly. Questions that weren't aimed at me anymore. Questions aimed at the system. The treasurer started to answer vaguely. The secretary tried to pivot. Then the president did something surprising. She said the cap trial had been introduced as a temporary response to repeated after-hours misuse reported by a board advisor. Board advisor. Everyone knew who that was. Ms. shifted in her seat. Someone nearby glanced back at her. Another resident asked if this advisor was present. The president looked uncomfortable but said yes. Now the room turned. Not sharply, but unmistakably. Like a spotlight rotating. Ms. stood up with this practiced smile, clearly trying to keep the moment from turning on her. She said she'd been concerned about safety, and that she'd seen large groups late at night. She implied I was one of them without saying my name. Normally, that kind of insinuation works. It floats in the air and makes people nervous. But not when everyone had already watched the cap hurt them too. A resident asked if she'd provided any photos or specific dates. Another asked if she'd filed formal complaints or just reported concerns verbally. Someone else asked why her concerns had turned into a rule trial without a vote. She kept giving thin answers, general, slippery, nothing you could grab. That's when the security supervisor, who had been silent all meeting, stepped forward. He asked to speak. The president looked startled, then nodded. He said security had been instructed to enforce a guest cap more strictly in relation to a specific household after repeated board complaints. He didn't say my unit number on the mic, but he didn't have to. The whole room understood. A wave of disbelief moved through the chairs like wind through tall grass. He added that security had not been given a fixed cap number initially, only a directive to monitor guest-heavy groups after 7. In other words, they'd used security discretion as a targeting tool. Ms. R's face tightened into something sharp and pale. She tried to speak, but the president cut in and thanked the supervisor for the clarity. It was one of those moments where the floor drops out under someone's authority. No screaming. No theatrics. Just the hard click of truth landing. The president said, on record, that the board would review how such directives were issued and would require all security enforcement to follow posted numeric rules going forward. She also said any board advisors not holding elected seats would not have authority to direct staff. That line was the quiet guillotine. Ms. sat down. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The room had already looked for me. The climax wasn't me winning over her on a personal level. It was the system snapping back into fairness because the community saw the receipts. And for the first time in months, I felt like we actually lived in a neighborhood again, not a tiny kingdom. After the meeting ended, people lingered in the hallway, buzzing in that post-drama way where everyone is both exhausted and weirdly energized. Someone patted my shoulder. A couple neighbors thanked me for speaking up. One joked that we should have had a pool float shaped like a gavel. I smiled, but I wasn't feeling triumphant in a cartoon way. More like, steady. Grounded. The kind of relief you get when something that felt surreal finally becomes real and public. Over the next week, the difference at the pool was immediate. The laminated, enhanced monitoring placard disappeared. The guard stopped acting like a bouncer and started acting like staff again, friendly, consistent, and, honestly, a little sheepish. The property manager posted a clear interim rule on the portal: daytime guest limit applies after dark until a new policy is voted on. For the first time that season, I brought friends to a sunset swim without bracing myself. The deck lights clicked on, cicadas hummed in the trees, and nobody stopped us. The pool felt normal again. I also got an official email from the board confirming my fine was voided, and that my May 12 notice was being reclassified as informational rather than punitive due to lack of evidence. They didn't say they'd been wrong. They just quietly unwound their paper weapon. A week later, a community survey went out asking residents what a reasonable evening guest policy would be. Most folks voted for a per household number, clearly posted, no vague cap. The new policy passed the following month: 2 guests per resident after 7 p.m., unless the pool exceeded 40 people, in which case guests would pause until occupancy dropped again. Simple. Logical. Transparent. Ms. R didn't attend meetings anymore. She still lived nearby, still did her brisk walks on the lake path, still wore that sharp "I'm important" posture, but her influence had evaporated. People weren't rude to her. They were just uninterested. Her power had depended on secrecy and fear, and now everyone had seen the mechanism. The funniest part was how quietly it happened. No public shaming post. No dramatic confrontation at the gate. Just reality resetting itself. And me? I didn't become some neighborhood rebel leader. I went back to being a person who swims sometimes after dinner and likes bringing friends to watch the lights on the water. That's all I wanted. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't change me a little. I used to think the safest way to live under a committee like that was to keep your head down and hope you don't become a target. Now I know that's exactly how targets get chosen. Quiet compliance isn't peace, it's permission. The cost of pushing back was real. Weeks of tension, awkward walks past neighbors, friends feeling uncomfortable, that low-level stress that sits on your chest like a weight. I hated that part. I still do. But the payoff wasn't just personal. The payoff was restoring a shared space to the shared rules it was supposed to have. The payoff was watching the community remember it had a voice. When I think back to that first night my friends were turned away under those harsh gate lights, I'm almost grateful it happened exactly like that. Because if they'd been even a little more subtle, I might have swallowed it and moved on. Instead, they got greedy. They got sloppy. And in trying to embarrass me, they handed me the clearest path to stop them. By the time summer ended, the pool was back to laughter, not whispers. You could hear splashes echoing off the fence at night again, and the deck chairs weren't props in some petty play. They were just chairs. Normal felt like revenge in the best way. Tell me your HOA horror in one line. And if you're thinking this was the end of my association saga, yeah, I thought so too. Because just when things settled, I noticed a fresh notice pinned to the clubhouse board one chilly morning. New agenda. New Community Safety Initiative. And a familiar name tucked into the fine print as a volunteer advisor again. Different issue. Same instinct to control. So next time, I'm telling you about the neighborhood parking war that exploded right after the pool fight, and why the same people who tried to gatekeep the water decided they owned the street too.